Welcome to the Football Reporters, a new podcast from ESPN FC. I'm Mark Ogden.
I'm Rob Dawson.
And I'm James Olley. And this week, what exactly has been going on at Chelsea? Are the leadership at the club disruptors, or are they disruptive to a club that enjoyed nearly 2 decades of previous success?
And is Erik already on borrowed time? And has anything actually changed from last season?
And what about Mo Salah's post-match comments after Man United's game against Liverpool? A statement of intent, or the start of a game of chicken between the player and the club? £1.2 billion, that's the money that's been spent by Chelsea since the takeover by Todd Boehly and the Clear Lake Consortium at the end of the 2022 season.
40 players have arrived at huge cost, and 38 have already left permanently during that time.
Now, fans who are used to kind of unbroken success under Roman Abramovich are becoming restless.
James, you're on the Chelsea beat week to week. Your big piece examining the club is going live on the website later this week. There's a lot to unpack, a lot of detail in there. Where do you want to start?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that there is a plan. It doesn't appear clear at times because of the volume of transactions that have taken place, the amount of players who've come and gone in those 2 years have included players they've signed themselves, so it can look as though they're sort of compounding their errors by signing one player for this position, ripping up the rule book for why they signed that player and then going in a different direction. Which is not to say that there's a grand master plan for all of this, but they are thinking clearly with a route to building a squad predominantly of players who are under 24 on long-term contracts that they think can be the nucleus of bringing success to that club for a number of years. The other sort of confusing element of this, I think, is that there are a lot of voices in the mix. There's obviously co-owners, there are co-sporting directors, there's a head of recruitment, there's a global head of recruitment, there are scouts, there are data analysts, there's a lot of people, the manager, a lot of people who have input into the recruitment strategy. And I think that has contributed to a sense of confusion externally, because some people have won those arguments on certain occasions and others have won them on other occasions, and that has led to what's looked like more of an incoherent strategy than maybe you'd expect from an elite club.
If you're a Chelsea fan, can you reassure the fans that this will settle down? The idea is that at some point, as you said, there is a plan, but at the moment, 2 years in, it looks kind of chaotic. I mean, I've spoken to people, you've spoken to people who've either work at Chelsea or been at Chelsea, and the sense of confusion is pretty strong because there are too many cooks, I guess. Yeah,
so to answer that directly, the first point, yes, the expectation from Clear Lake is that it will settle down now. I mean, obviously this number of just the expenditure firstly, but then also the number of transactions is just destabilising for any club in any sort of set of circumstances. You can't just churn 15, 20 players every window and expect there to be any kind of continuity at the club. I think it's worth sort of outlining that there are 2 phases to the Chelsea project since the Boehly Clear Lake takeover 2 years ago. So the first phase that they sort of refer to is called the blast phase, that basically this is what a lot of new owners come in when they've got a bit of money and they want to splash the cash. So they want to make some statement signings, they want to show the fans that they're serious. For all the rights and the wrongs of the Roman Abramovich era, they were ruthless, they were single-minded, they were that was a streamlined club that was driven towards success, and they were successful. They had, they never went 2 seasons without a trophy like this new ownership have done. So they tried to sort of dish out these big contracts, sign these big players. Raheem Sterling, of course, was the first one, and it's quite neat to use him as a through line for all of this. So, he was signed on big wages from a big club. What would he have been, 27 I think when he signed, so peak years. This was kind of the model where they felt inspired in part by Thomas Tuchel, who's the head coach at the time, who felt, look, we only need maybe 3 or 4 of these kind of big name ready to go, straight off. Don't need 6 months adaptation or a period of time to grow up or learn the game. We want them to come in now and be able to hit the ground running immediately. That was the first phase of that, and then they realised that after a period of time that actually this isn't really sustainable, firstly, and secondly that if these players don't work out, we're stuck with them on huge wages. So there was a pivot away from that towards players predominantly under 24 that they could sign on much, much longer contracts. So the standard, typical 3, 4, 5 year deals suddenly became 7, 8, 9 year deals for a number of reasons. Firstly, the wages. So a lot of these players are on much, much lower wages than someone like Raheem Sterling, who came in £325,000 a week, and there were no standard reduction clauses in that contract. So normally if a club that expects to compete for the title or certainly in the top 4 every year, if they don't get into Champions League, there's normally a reduction clause in that contract that states that player from 325 comes down quite a bit because the revenue is effectively commensurate with the reduction in revenue. That wasn't in Raheem Sterling's contract, and a number of those deals were quite naively negotiated. The way they're doing it now is they're saying to Mykhailo Mudryk or a Cole Palmer, well, yes, you're signing 7, 8, 9 years and your basic wage is very low, but it's heavily incentivised. And one of the things in the piece that we reveal is that the Cole Palmer contract extension, everybody sort of wrote that as a new deal at the time. It wasn't. That was a deal that the club effectively were obliged to do, obligated to do, because it was written into his contract. And they see that as a sign of success, that this is the new model working, that someone like Cole Palmer can start with relatively low expectations, become PFA Young Player of the Year, and is rewarded accordingly.
The one thing I'd say about this, and maybe it is a slight defence of Chelsea, because they have been taking a lot of stick, haven't they, for their what is perceived to be their plan, is that squad building is hard. It's probably the hardest thing in football, and that if there was a set plan that worked for everyone, then everyone would do it, and they don't. You see massive clubs, particularly at elite level, Man United is one, Barcelona is another, that struggle to have a clear, or have struggled to have a clear strategy in terms of how they recruit players and build a squad to win trophies year after year. That the one team probably that's managed it above everyone else is Man City. But there isn't a clear plan because everyone would do it. If there was a set way of doing it, everyone would do it.
But on that, Rob, just on that, bear in mind, 12 months before Chelsea were taken over, they were the champions of Europe. They won the Champions League. They qualified for the Champions League in the season that the takeover happened. So you could argue that, although it wasn't perfect, the Abramovich model was kind of based on big money. They had a squad in place, and the Clearlake group have come in and ripped it all up and started again, thinking that they know best, and they clearly don't.
No, I think I'm not sure you can say that they clearly don't know best, because, as I say, that if there was a set plan that clubs could follow and that everyone did it, and then Chelsea came in and did something completely different, then you could look at them and go, what are you doing? You've got no idea what you're doing. But recruitment, by its very nature, is a gamble. And I think you put in your piece, don't you, that you're basically hedging your bets. And United used to say this all the time when they would do transfers, is that they aim for a threshold of getting 70% of their transfers right. Now, that was, in their eyes, that was like the golden mark, 70%. But if you talk about 30% of your transfers failing, that is a huge amount of money wasted. So why would you look at a system that basically costs you a huge amount of money, because you're essentially saying that 30% of the players that you sign are going to fail, and not look at that recruitment plan and go, maybe there's a way that we can do this better? Now, I'm not saying that Chelsea's plan definitely will work, but there's a quote in Moneyball about, they changed the way that the baseball team recruited, and there's a quote that the first one through the door always gets bloody. The guy that tries to change everything is always going to get criticised. And this is perhaps what we're seeing now. And I don't necessarily think that maybe we do in 5 years, we look back and go, what were Chelsea doing? That's an absolute mess. But it does seem to me to be method in the madness.
Well, one thing off the back of that, when you talk about the 70% figure, I don't think Chelsea, I don't think their view is that they can get that to 90 or 100. I think actually what this long contract strategy gives them is a much of an easier exit for some of those players that don't work out. So somebody close to Clearlake was sort of telling me that effectively, if you've got a group of players who are on, let's say, so the average Premier League wage is 72 grand. Chelsea's average wage now is about 60. And that's because these players are on hugely incentivised contracts that if they hit those targets, but if they don't, then suddenly a player who's on 60 grand a week could go to a Brighton, a West Ham, an Everton, a Villa. He's not, as Raheem Sterling on 325. He's not priced out immediately of all but a handful of clubs across Europe, across the world, because of the contract that he sat on. So they are arguing that actually, while the 7, 8, 9 years gives the player and the club security, it also gives the club the option to be able to jettison someone a bit easier to a wider market because the wage is not prohibitive.
But does that stack up in the sense that Mudryk was £88 million, you've got Enzo Fernandez £105 million, Caicedo was in excess of that. These are massive fees. If you're on a massive fee, you're not going to go there for a low wage because other clubs will be... Caicedo could have gone to Liverpool, Mudryk could have gone to Arsenal. Had he gone to Chelsea on a bigger fee for a lower wage and a longer contract? I think what Chelsea are trying to say is that, it's fine, we're going to be okay because we're on low wages. That'll be a lot of the players, but not all of them. And I think the reality is it's that I think they're feeling the way and they're making mistakes. And just one thing I want to ask you about this is, do you think Todd Boehly's getting a bad rap? Because he was the guy, like Rob said, the first guy that comes in gets blooded. He was the front of it. But since maybe the last 18 months, he's not really been driving it. It's been Erik, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. There's been a shift behind the scenes in terms of the sort of key influential decision makers. Todd Boehly's still very much part of it, but I think again you have to remember that the volume of churn at this club at all levels is unprecedented in elite football because you're talking about a change of ownership, a change of staff, and then this churn of players. It's incredible the amount of change that there's been at that club in the last sort of 3 years, and that first summer when Clearlake and Boehly completed their takeover, Todd Boehly was acting sporting director, and he spoke very bullishly about wanting to shake things up. If you think about those North versus South All-Star game ideas he had, and all these kind of radical ideas to sort of revolutionise the Premier League, you don't hear that anymore from him. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that I think he's had his nose bloodied a little bit by learning on the job as he had to in that first summer, and also I think that Clearlake have decided that they, Bedad Egbali's taken a bit more of a sort of hands-on, more prominent role, and he's certainly moved ahead of Boehly in terms of the key decision maker at the club in particularly in the last year.
So the big, there's been lots of big signings at Chelsea, some lots of big deals, but the one that's caught most headlines is Raheem Sterling leaving the club. I think he was prominent in pre-season. You were in America on the pre-season tour. He was involved. He was used by Maresca. And then the season starts, and he's told a day or two before the season starts, "You're not in the plans." We were told, I think you've been told as well, that they were trying to get him to move to Saudi Arabia. He didn't want to go to Saudi Arabia. Felt he was being forced out of the club. So there was suggestion of a move to Man United at one point. How did he end up at Arsenal? And Chelsea obviously are taking a hit on that, aren't they?
So this was a decision that was taken during pre-season, and Raheem Sterling played in all 6 games in pre-season, but he only started 2 of them. And I think it became clear quite early on that Maresca just didn't fancy him. Clearlake strongly deny any suggestion that any pressure was put on Maresca because of his wage, but it's easy to think that his wage would have been a factor that would have carried against him when they were weighing up whether to make him part of the first team squad or not. And again, this comes back to the data side of it. So one of the things that Boehly and Egbali sort of said privately when they took over the club was that they felt they had this fantastic analytics department that they didn't really use enough. And their internal numbers, and this is just how they feel that Jadon Sancho and João Felix, who are similar profiles of player, are better suited to what they want to do than Raheem Sterling. They're younger, they feel they've got more capacity to improve. Obviously, Jadon Sancho's not had a great time at United. João Felix has kind of gone off the boil a little bit. He's not the player that was at 113 million they paid for him. He's not that player at the moment. And again, they feel, well, with the market values as they were, Sancho was 72 million for United. They've got him for 25-ish on an obligation next summer. João Felix, I think, was about 43, so come way down from the 113. So all of these metrics that they use, they feel led them to believe that Raheem Sterling is not the best winger that they could have at their disposal come September the 2nd. So they then decided to try and find him a club. Now, my understanding was that his availability was circulated for probably a couple of weeks before he went, and I think, deadline day when he moved to Arsenal, that wasn't the first time Arsenal had been offered him. But I was told that very, very late in the window, it was actually Chelsea who dropped their demands for Sterling and basically said, look, we need to get him off the books. We don't need to accept a loan fee, and we'll accept you paying less than half of his wages. So we are in this quite bizarre position where Chelsea are actually paying Arsenal around £10 million to play Raheem Sterling.
And this isn't a new phenomenon, is it, though? I mean, I know that the Sterling situation will catch a lot of people's attention because he was a player signed under Todd Boehly's ownership, and now a couple of years later they're trying to desperately to shift him and taking a massive hit. But you look back at what City did when they were first taken over. They did the same with players like Craig Bellamy, Adebayor, Wayne Bridge. I think all these players who they brought in to make an immediate impact, and then changed their philosophy, I suppose, and wanted to go into a more long-term plan. Did exactly the same. I remember going to watch a City reserve team game at Ashton-under-Lyne once in front of about 100 people with Adebayor and Bellamy and Wayne Bridge all playing because they were desperate to get them off the books, and they were offering them to any club that were willing to listen because they just wanted them out, and ended up paying huge amounts of money to have them play for other clubs to allow them in the future to then go and execute the philosophy that they wanted to do. So as long as it works out for Chelsea moving forward.
Well, and if they've complied with the rules, and that's the big question, because my sources at Clear Lake tell me that they believe they are fully compliant for 2022-23 and 23-24. Obviously, it's 24-25 now, so we've got to see what comes there. It's hard to see from the outside how those numbers stack up. There is, in the 22-23 accounts, they include 2 hotel sales where the hotels were sold from one club under the Chelsea umbrella to another club in the Chelsea umbrella. That is currently allowed by the Premier League rules, although those 2 deals specifically haven't been ratified as fair market value. That's a separate issue. But in UEFA's context, they don't allow those kind of transactions at all. So you do start to wonder whether, if they've not been able to balance the books across 24-25, how can they possibly comply with only losing 105 million over 3 seasons, which is the PSR rule. As I say, they have consistently said they are okay, they are able to comply with every regulation, they're not sweating it. I suppose one thing to say as well, when you talk about other clubs, PSR is an issue for a lot of sides, and we talk about the churn here at Chelsea. You look at Scott McTominay leaving Manchester United. Arsenal had to sell Eddie Nketiah and they didn't have to sell Eddie Nketiah and Emil Smith-Rowe, but they did so because those academy graduates count as pure profit on the balance sheet. And if you want to be aggressive in the market and satisfy the fan demand for new signings, the shortest route to doing that is to selling the players that you produce
and
themselves.
To that point, in your piece, I think you start off with it. Conor Gallagher, he was a lightning rod really at the start of the season. We were at the game against Man City on the opening day. Halfway through the first half, the fans are chanting his name. Now, the Chelsea fans were unhappy that Conor Gallagher was let go because he was one of their better players last year. But the reality is that, first of all, like you say, he's part of that batch of players, homegrown players, pure profit, but also he wasn't signing any contract. So the flip side was, let him stay at the club and let him play this season and leave for nothing next year. Then who's messed up there? That would be the Chelsea owner. So I think the only issue is that was the right business plan. It's just the way they executed it in terms of saying, right, you're training with the reserve.
Well, he's a good. I think the only way to cut through all of this is to kind of look at the individual cases and use them as case studies. So Conor Gallagher is a really good example, and you're right. 22 minutes into the new season, they're 1-0 down at home to Man City, and what's the name that the fans sing? It's Conor Gallagher, who's not in the matchday squad. They know he's leaving. They're not singing the new manager's name. They're not singing the club's name. They're not singing any of the players they've spent £1.2 billion on. They're singing the name of an academy graduate. And the reason they're doing that is because there's a bit of an identity crisis at Chelsea. These fans don't know what they're seeing. They don't know what they can buy into. And I think a lot of them feel that while Conor Gallagher isn't the world's greatest midfielder, he worked hard. He was one of their best players last season. He had a genuine affinity and love for the club. And yet he's been shipped out. Now, as you say, what's the responsibility? Where does that lie? Well, they only offered him a 2-year contract. And this is, again, another problem with these 7, 8, 9-year deals as a template. If, as a player, you're offered a 2-year contract with the option of a 3rd year, and everybody in the dressing room is getting 6, 7, 8, 9 years, you are kind of looking around going, what's wrong with me? What have I done wrong? And he was told that, well, look, again, my understanding, my information with that was that he was given a salary that was commensurate with some of the higher earners. So they were kind of saying to him, look, you're not getting as long a deal, but you are getting more money.
So it's a better deal, really, because he's not stuck there for 9 years.
So there is an argument that Conor Gallagher could have signed that contract, waited it out for a year, but he was told with Lavia, Fernandes and Caicedo that will be the midfield three, and he wouldn't be playing every week.
They brought Dewsbury Hall as well, who's the manager's son.
Of course, they've got Dewsbury Hall. They've got, you know, the one thing Chelsea have got in the midfield and up front are plenty of options, and they put a lot of obstacles in place between where Gallagher was stood and the first team. And Atletico Madrid, let's not forget, are a big club in their own right. That is a fantastic opportunity for him. They're in the Champions League this season. Obviously, Chelsea aren't. They're a Conference League side at the moment. So, you know, this wasn't just purely a case of, Conor Gallagher's the victim and he's been forced out. He was offered 3 contracts, as far as I'm aware. He was offered a contract a year ago, and then he was offered one in June and one in July. So the club did make an effort to keep him. But depending on where you sit on this whole 7, 8, 9 year contract strategy, it's either an insult to him that he wasn't offered that contract, or the player's not shown enough patience to say, well, I'll earn one by playing well and signing this deal and then earning one over the next year or two.
And that was a point in your piece, wasn't it, about if you play, we'll pay kind of thing, that there has to be an element of confidence of a player to say, well, I don't mind, even if it's taking a lower weekly wage, say it is 60 grand as opposed to 80 grand you could get elsewhere, or, you know, accepting a 3-year deal when other players in the dressing room are getting 7, 8, 9. You can understand why a player would look at that and think that's not really on. But part of that is the player looking at himself and looking at how he fits into that team and backing himself to say, well, it doesn't actually matter if I've only got 3 years because I'm going to play so well. I'm going to get my weekly wage bumped up to that 80 grand, and also they're going to have to offer me a longer contract because I'm going to become integral to this team. The flip side of that is that players love stability, don't they? That they don't want to be bouncing around looking for contracts after a year or two.
Players love money, let's be honest. They like stability, but they like a big wage packet and a decent contract.
They also like stability because all it takes is one tackle in training, you've done your cruise ship and that's you've done for 2 years, and then you've not got a contract and no one touches you ever again. So you can understand why that Conor Gallagher, you know, for all I'm saying, it's important for players to back themselves. You can understand why someone like Conor Gallagher is thinking, well, why is Mudryk sat there on a 9-year deal?
But I think if you're an agent, a smart agent, you say to your player, don't sign a 9-year contract, don't sign an 8-year contract, sign a 4 or 5 year contract at best, and then give yourself some flexibility. Because by signing a 9-year contract, an 8-year contract, you're pinning yourself to a club that, you know, Cole Palmer signed his extension. He deserved it. He had a great season last year. He's one of the very few bright spots. But at some point, he's going to want to play Champions League. He's a Champions League player. They're in the Conference League this season. Who knows what competition Chelsea will be in next year? If they're not in the Champions League next season and Cole Palmer continues to progress, he will at some point want to leave. But he's on a 9-year contract, so what happens then? That is the problem that these players have got. I think sometimes there's a middle ground whereby an agent should say, look, mate, just don't pin yourself to such a long contract. Stability is one thing, but ambition is something else.
Just on that, the interesting thing I found about the Sterling example was Maresca owned that decision, didn't he? He said that he is not my, what's the quote, that he's not my type of winger. Now, I think you're suggesting that maybe it was a bit of a more of a club decision and he kind of bore the brunt with that quote. But if we take that on face value, that he's saying Raheem's not my type of winger, what's to say that Maresca gets sacked in 6 months, someone comes in who goes, Cole Palmer, good player, not my type of winger? Well,
this is what really did for Mauricio Pochettino and actually for Thomas Tuchel, because both of those managers experienced, used to kind of get in their own way, really. I mean, I know Pochettino obviously dealt with PSG and that was a sort of different situation, but they're kind of managers who are used to having a strong input and there being a tight, smaller recruitment team around them where their voice carries more weight. And I think one of the things that Pochettino got particularly frustrated by was just how many voices there are in the room at Chelsea.
And how little his voice carried, basically.
Yeah, and that it's all well and good you being asked for your input, but then you're presented with the player that the club wants to sign. And when you factor in the 2 co-sporting directors, all of the recruitment staff we've mentioned, how important they feel the analytics side of it should be in recruitment, the Moneyball idea. If you're a manager, you know your one voice in 8, 10, 12, yes, a significant one, obviously, and the one benefit you do have is you've got a public forum every Friday at a press conference where if you really want to put some pressure on, you can do, but that's only going to get you into trouble with the owners who want you to toe the party line. Thomas Tuchel didn't do it. Pochettino got increasingly frustrated by it, and this is why I think some of the Chelsea fans see Enzo Maresca as a bit of a yes man for the ownership, because he's been. But I think from his point of view, he's done exactly the right thing here. They have to own this. They have to. If this sort of kind of disruption is going to succeed, they all have to be on the same page, and they probably won't be in a year's time, but they have to be at the start, because if they're not, they're dead. They have to be at the start, and to be fair to Maresca and the ownership, they have got themselves to a place where they agree broadly with what they're doing. Now, they lose 3 of the next 5 games, couple of injuries, they miss out on they don't get a striker in January, Maresca starts maybe making the odd comment,
moaning.
We can see how it could potentially unravel, but let's give them, let's give them their due here and say there is a plan they feel they are working towards. It has caused a lot of consternation in football, but they're innovators, and they've given us something to talk about, if nothing else.
Just to wrap up on Chelsea, what does success look like for Chelsea? Is it trophies, or is it the owners having a lot of players that they can basically make a profit on in years to come?
Okay, so there's a short-term and there's a long-term answer to that. The short-term answer is they need a piece of silverware, in the same way that Cole Palmer is a bit of a poster boy for this methodology. So now they can say, look, he's signed this short-term deal, he's played, he's progressed, he's signed a better deal. This is what we want our other players to do. They need a trophy to validate what they're doing. You think about, I always think about Mikel Arteta. He probably would have lost his job had he not won the FA Cup, because he needed that to sort of say, look, this is tangible evidence of what I can do, where we're going. And I think they desperately need a trophy this season to validate themselves. The target internally, I'm told, is top 4. Maresca's been told he needs to get them back into the Champions League. That's not to say if they miss out, they're going to sack him automatically. I think if they got 5th and they maybe won the trophy, or they were very, very close and things were progressing well, then I think you'll get another year. But, from a revenue point of view, and that comes to the second part of the answer, they've got to get back in the Champions League for their revenue streams. But I think ultimately the ownership, if they look to sell in 5-10 years' time, they feel that acquiring all of these individual talents and moulding them together as a squad will help the overall value of the club. Plus, the global appeal of the Premier League will mean that number will go up anyway. So, the 2.5 they spent, 2.5 billion they spent to acquire the club, plus the 1.75 in the investment, it's 4.25. What would Chelsea be available for in the market in 5 years' time? Could be 6, could be 7, could be 8, and they've made huge money, and they're the ones laughing all the way to the bank at the end.
I think one thing to say is that Chelsea have been a very newsworthy club for even longer than when Roman Abramovich was there in 2003-04. So that'll continue this season and beyond.
Sunday's game between Manchester United and Liverpool could hardly have gone any worse for Erik ten Hag. Aside from the calamitous performance by Casemiro, who was substituted at half-time, he then had to listen to Liverpool boss Arne Slot effectively talk through his tactics in a public forum after the game.
Now we're going into the first international break of the season. 3 Premier League games in, 2 defeats. There's already talk of Ten Hag's job being under threat, having signed a new contract in the summer. So, Rob, I know you spoke to some of the leadership at United on Sunday. Is his job safe?
They say it is. And just a bit of background on it. So we saw Dan Ashworth and Omar Barada in the United boardroom before the Liverpool game. It's important to stress that we saw him before the Liverpool game. There was an expectation that perhaps we would have seen some of the new leadership team on the US tour in the summer. We have done in the past when it's been other people in charge. It's kind of viewed as a more relaxed environment. Their reason for not seeing us on the US tour was that the transfer window was still in full swing. They were thinking about all these deals that they had to do. They didn't want to sort of comment on players who may or may not be coming in, so they wanted to give a bit of breathing space between the transfer window and them talking to reporters, which is why they did it before the Liverpool game, just to kind of explain really I suppose the new era at Man United and how they've approached this first window. So the top line that came out of that chat with Barada and Ashworth was that they are backing Erik ten Hag. People in the room made the point that you do know you're saying this ahead of a game that could see United lose relatively heavily. That they were fully aware that may happen. Obviously, they didn't want it to, but they were fully aware that might happen. And the line was that they are in full support of him. They gave him, or they triggered that 1-year extension to his contract in the summer for a reason, and that he is the manager, as they called it, for their project. The only thing that I think is worth saying on this, a minor point I suppose, was that both Ashworth and Barada made the point very specifically that the decision to extend Erik ten Hag's contract predated them coming in. So they started officially in July. Dan Ashworth before Omar Barada. The decision to extend Erik ten Hag's contract was made public in June. Now, whether you think that they were already kind of in their roles in a back seat is beside the point. They were very specific in that this decision about Erik ten Hag's contract was made before they started work. So they have distanced themselves a little bit.
Well, it's not the most.
This.
It's not the most ringing endorsement, is it?
It's not. But the contract in itself isn't either. In that, again, there was, or we were told when they made the decision to stick with Erik ten Hag that now new contract talks would take place. The expectation was that they would discuss a new contract, that it would be new set of terms, new set of responsibilities for the manager, and perhaps a 2 or 3 year deal to take him forward. In the end, what happened was there was already a 1-year extension built into his existing contract when he joined from Ajax. And instead of negotiating new terms or a new role for Ten Hag, all they did was trigger that extension. Look, so now he's under contract for an extra year till 2025.
One point of this podcast is to kind of cut through not the nonsense, but kind of the spin and the PR. And I think Jamie Carragher said after the game at the weekend on Sky that, let's be honest, Man United were meeting agents and managers all over Europe, and they were. We know that. I mean, we've all read. I think we all wrote that Gareth Southgate was very high on their list as early as February, March. They spoke to, I think, Kieran McKenna, Mauricio Pochettino, Thomas Tuchel, and they were not shy about this. And even back in February, March time, when I wrote about Southgate, there was no pushback from the club. It was almost like, well, it is what it is. Now, the reality is that Erik ten Hag surprised us all by winning the cup final against Man City. None of us expected it. And he, at the end of the game, I was at the game that day, you were at the game, he was waving to the fans. He was tapping his blazer as if to say, there you go, thanks for all your love and support. There's the FA Cup, I'm off. He expected to go. Now, a week or two later, as we know, I mean, the day before, the report saying he was going to be sacked.
Again, no pushback from the club.
No pushback. But I think, I pretty much know.
And also Ten Hag wasn't told that was wrong.
Yeah, but I've been told since that the ownership was surprised by the strength of feeling towards Ten Hag, and I think they realised that Gareth Southgate was always a hard sell because for whatever reason he's deemed to be England manager, haven't won anything. I think that's very harsh, but still, it was a hard sell at the time. It's an even harder sell when the guy that you're about to sack has just won the FA Cup. So I think Ineos looked at it and thought, we've got a lot of changes behind the scenes this year. We've got Dan Ashworth, Barada coming in, and one thing that was mentioned to me was they can't really make such a significant decision as the new manager without their guys in place. And like you say, Barada arrived in June. They didn't expect Dan Ashworth to be in place until September at the earliest.
That was a very late deal.
Exactly. So it was like, well, we've got a lot of change coming. Why add to the churn by getting rid of the manager? Let's kind of the window dressing of this new deal, which wasn't a new deal, it was just an extension. And let's see how we go. Now, as we know, they started badly. He's not the Ineos guy. He's not Barada's guy. He's not Ashworth's guy. When clubs change ownership or change regime, within a year, it's very, very rare that the manager stays. I think that Ten Hag is on thin ice already. They might say it is, but that was before the game against the weekend, so we'll see.
No one at the club is denying that this is a very difficult relationship now between Ten Hag and the new ownership. Now, Dan Ashworth, when we spoke to him on Sunday, was very, very keen to stress that they have got on. He said they've got on very well for the last 8 weeks and they've played a full part together in this transfer window. But there are people at United who are viewing this relationship, the way they've put it, it's like a married couple where one party's had an affair and now they're trying to get back together, they're trying to make it work. There's no denying, though, that is a very, very difficult thing to do. Ten Hag is fully aware that they went out, like you said, to speak to a load of other managers and for a number of different reasons arrived back at Erik ten Hag. And you're right, because I bumped into someone after walking out of the cup final actually at Wembley, someone who's close to Ten Hag, and actually said to him, "This is great, great chance for Erik to stay now." And he went, "Nah, I don't think so. I think that's what a way to end, but no, I don't think so." At some stage, I think it was to do with a number of different factors, they've arrived back at Erik ten Hag, and you're right, because of that uncertainty, there is a doubt now about Erik ten Hag's job every time they have a negative result, because the two things that cost managers' jobs are new owners who come in and want their own man and poor results. And at the moment, Ten Hag is dealing with both of those things.
I also think that, that obviously it's now a case of how much pressure is there going to be on him. In a way, the international break is great because it means that, he's not got another game that he could lose in 3 days' time. And look, I mean, that's Southampton. Is it Southampton away they've got? I mean, that's if they don't win that,
it's horrible.
It's an absolute.
It's loot because you have to win, and if you don't win, you.
Yeah, but I think it puts a lot of pressure on Ten Hag more than is sort of standard in these scenarios, to have a pundit like Jamie Carragher basically publicly state what has been written. It's not new information, but I think when there's paper talk and there's stuff that we write and there's things that there's sort of a degree of separation from that. But I think when you're covering that game in that capacity, and they're interviewing the managers, they're speaking to he stood on the pitch saying it at Old Trafford. I think it brings it into a different perspective for a lot of the audience, a lot of the supporters, who can now effectively take that as fact, which is not to say they wouldn't believe us and they'd believe Jamie Carragher, but I think there's probably some people who would in that situation. And do you know what I mean? I think
it's a different voice, and it's certainly, I don't know.
But it's now become an accepted part of the conversation around Ten Hag. Yeah. That they wanted another manager in the summer. Whereas I think before Sunday, it felt as though, yes, there are people who are saying that. Yes, it's been written in a lot of places. We've said it on our site. Both of you guys have been across that story from the get-go. But when you've got someone with that profile in the stadium covering the game, effectively stating that as fact, it is putting Ten Hag under huge pressure in the eyes of the watching public.
And Jamie Carragher does a column for The Telegraph at the weekend. I thought it was a really good column, and it's something that hadn't really occurred to me, but when you read it, it's so obvious that it's right. He said that this feels like the end days of Brendan Rodgers at Liverpool. Now, Brendan Rodgers at Liverpool went into his final season with a dispute, kind of a player dispute over it in terms of recruitment, that Liverpool wanted to sign Roberto Firmino, he wanted to sign Christian Benteke, and they signed both. They didn't really want Benteke, but they wanted to back the manager. Now, this summer we've seen at United, they brought in some of Ten Hag's targets and some of the club's targets. It's almost like a twin approach. But the point that Carragher made was that the winds of change were already there, and Brendan Rodgers was sacked by the October international break. Now, Erik ten Hag, or Man United, have got 7 games now between now and the October international break. So they'll come back after this international break, Southampton away. 7 games. Now, he's got Manuel Ugarte from PSG. That is the big signing, because that means that the Casemiro problem is solved to a certain extent. Hopefully, he's the final piece of the jigsaw in many ways. Now, Manuel Ugarte, the poor guy that he is, has got massive pressure on now to be this saviour, and he probably isn't. But Ten Hag has to make it work now. And if in those 7 games United don't turn it around, they've got some tough games. Southampton away, Aston Villa away, tough game. They've got Champions League games. I think they got Fenerbahce just after the international break, the October international break. I think Erik ten Hag is now in a situation where he's got 7 games to save his job. It might sound ridiculous, but if in the next 7 games the situation is as bad as it is now, Gareth Southgate by then will have been on a 3-month holiday. He knows Dan Ashworth very well. He knows Dave Brailsford very well. He's a big part of the Ineos project. Now, right from day one when I wrote about Gareth Southgate at Man United, I was bombarded with, that's rubbish, you're just saying that because you like Southgate. It's not, we write what we're told, not what we want. And that's what, this kind of misconception sometimes. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not saying here that Gareth Southgate was the Man United manager in October. I'm not saying that, but he's available. People at the club like him. They're clearly not sold on Ten Hag. And if in the next 7 games it doesn't work, then the difficulty they had after the FA Cup final, because he just won a trophy, will have gone. Because by October, if they're 10th in the table, then... Well,
and again, I think Jamie Carragher is really, really good, by the way, just for the record. But I think one of the good point he made as well is Arne Slot already has got changes, patterns of play you can see in Liverpool in 3 games. And I remember Postecoglou was the same last year. Straight away, he came into Tottenham and you thought, okay, this is a different team, and there are you can see the ideas that might not be working all perfectly, but you can see there is an absolute coached methodology with largely the same group who are now trying to do something different. You still watch that team, United, and you still think it's just a collection of individuals, and you're hoping that somebody's going to do something.
Could have been day one.
I can't. That's the thing I can't understand about Sunday, is that we saw at the end of last season with the Palace game, that humiliation, the 4-0, that they were just far too open. Palace sprinting through midfield, Casemiro all over the place, having to cover huge amounts of space. And then after Palace, he made this really conscious decision to be more compact. Be harder to break down, almost play a little bit on the break. They had a couple of decent results. Newcastle at home, which could have gone the other way, but wasn't. Brighton away. Brighton were struggling at the end, but they still went there and won and beat City. And all of a sudden, you played Liverpool at home, and those same problems are there again. That you've got Casemiro roaming around midfield in huge spaces, Mainu diving into challenges because he just can't cover the space quick enough. And then you're looking at Liverpool with this really coherent, slick midfield structure where McAllister's going and Gravenberch is dropping in, or Gravenberch is going and McAllister's dropping in. United didn't run through Liverpool once.
Do you know it's a big part of the problem that it rarely gets highlighted, and Ten Hag has not yet, after 2 seasons and a bit, worked out to play with Bruno Fernandes, because Bruno Fernandes at times plays like a kid in the playground. He has got no kind of defensive discipline. He spends most of his time in the attacking third, and when you see that United have been hit on the counter attack and Casemiro having to put out fires, Bruno Fernandes is 30 yards away, with his arms in the air, saying, come on lads, defend. So now Bruno Fernandes is a very talented player. He's the team captain. He has signed a new contract in the summer, but I think Ten Hag has to find a way to assimilate him into the system. He's not done it, and he's supposed to be the best player. So as much as Casemiro is, sadly, yesterday's man, he's not being helped by the people around him. Now, just on what you made a really good point about Postecoglou and Slot, I think it's different with Slot because he's inherited a much better squad that Ten Hag walked into, but the confidence, the authority that Slot projects is very impressive. Totally different to Ten Hag. But Postecoglou, the same character, same personality. You could argue that the squad he has at Tottenham is on a par with United. They've got some great players. Son Heung-min, fantastic player, but generally, like for like, there's not much between those squads. But the difference at Tottenham to Man United is night and day. The vibe, everything, the tactics, and Ten Hag, I think he's running out of things to point to apart from his trophies. Now, great, he's won 2 trophies, fantastic. But let's not forget, they finished bottom of the easiest Champions League group they ever had last year, behind Copenhagen and Galatasaray. They finished 8th in the Premier League. 8th. But he's talking the trophies.
Should we, all right, to flip it on his head though, should we say, well look, when Højlund comes back, when Ugarte gets up to speed, De Ligt has had a few games, should we be saying, actually, if he's got his fully fit squad available, the squad that they've tailored over the course of the last 2 months, should we be judging him then rather than now?
See, I know that you said just then that you think that Ten Hag has got seven games to save his job, and I understand where you're coming from with that. I think that Ineos have got to stick with him now. They had a chance in the summer. They had, there would have been no massive fan reaction if Ten Hag had lost his job.
I think there would.
I don't think there would. People would have understood it. There would have been.
Obviously,
it depends who comes in, but there wouldn't have been people. Sensible Man United fans would have gone, "Oh, yeah, maybe I wanted Ten Hag to stay, but I can understand it. We finished 8th. That's not good enough."
It was easy to keep him. On your point, who would they have got? I think that was the issue. They did want Southgate, but Southgate was an impossible one to do because England were in the Euros and sort of right to the final. United's first game was the day after in Oslo, so the timing didn't fit.
And he wouldn't discuss it.
Exactly.
I was also told that a lot of managers who they spoke to were a little bit apprehensive because of the new structure that was being put in place. The managers that they spoke to were told that you'd have to answer to Barada, Ashworth and Wilcox in the main, and then they would make a decision, and then that decision would be put to a committee above them, which would be Radcliffe, Brailsford and Joel Glazer, and then that decision would either be seen through or scrapped. And someone like Thomas Tuchel looked at that after the problems he'd had at Bayern and went, that's too much. I'm not happy with how many hoops I've got to jump through, because ultimately I'm the guy that's going to get hired and fired on the results.
Tuchel doesn't fit their profile.
No.
Great manager that he is. It's sad to say, but he doesn't. They will want somebody who'll fit in that kind of organism, I guess, and work into that approach. And I think, McKenna was probably not ready for it. Pochettino, I think there was a few concerns that he was not very flexible with his backroom stuff. He always sets the same backroom stuff everywhere, and I think United wanted more control over that. Other ones that were in the mix, De Zerbi was in the mix. Again, there was concerns about De Zerbi. It tailed off very badly at Brighton. Now he's at Marseille.
Set fire to things at Brighton, didn't he?
Yeah, so there was no obvious kind of off-ramp, as they say.
No,
so it was easy to keep Ten Hag, but believe me, Jim Ratcliffe is a very ruthless guy. He's made that clear with the change that he's made behind the scenes with getting rid of lots of people from the job. If it's not working with Ten Hag, his patience is way for thin as it is.
I just think that you've got to see it through now. I think that you had a golden opportunity to change if you wanted to. You've triggered his extension. Obviously, it's not the new deal that perhaps we all thought was going to happen. Ten Hag, none of the recruitment responsibility was taken off him in the summer. He played a full part in recruitment. We saw the players that he's had in the past have come in. All these players arrived with Ten Hag's sign off. Once you do that and you spend so much money and you put such a public show of faith in him, you have to see it through now, I think.
But can he really survive another season where they're 6th, 7th, 8th, getting beaten heavily home and away by the biggest teams?
Well,
No.
that's the question. What is your threshold of pain, I suppose?
I mean, you've seen it at close hand at Arsenal. But it works at Arsenal because, Adu and Mikel Arteta and Josh Kroenke, who kind of runs the club for his dad, they are a unit, but Arteta was their guy, and they've backed him on that basis, haven't they? And I think Ten Hag, as he's not the Ineos guy, will never have that kind of support. That's why it works at Arsenal, because everybody knows the project or the philosophy, and it works. Until United get a manager that is the appointment of the owner, the regime of control, I think we're going to have this kind of uncertainty.
I think the other thing about Arsenal is the ownership have been flexible to mould the sort of decision-making team around the manager. They, without going back through the whole history of it, when Arsene Wenger was there and he was sort of the autonomous figure, they then appointed 9 new department heads that were supposed to strip all of the kind of autonomy away from the manager, and it was supposed to be a much more sort of collective decision-making process. But as Arteta came in and sort of said, well, actually, we need to streamline this, and it's kind of gone back to the head coach who works with just one or two, the sporting director and Edu and Josh Kroenke and Per Mertesacker, who heads up the academy. They're kind of the decision-makers with Tim Lewis, who then goes to the board. So there's only about 4 or 5 people who are involved in it, and it just feels, again, perhaps if we're relating this slightly back to Chelsea with United, but all these kind of, let's be honest, Ineos don't fully run the club, right? There's still the Glazers involved as well. So you've kind of got the two families are still part of it. The two sort of, I wouldn't call them warring factions, but the two families with the two different visions, and a manager's got to sit in the middle of all that somewhere. And at Chelsea, they found it very difficult when you've got the Boehly and the Egbali sort of two sides of it. And with Ineos and with the Glazers, it feels as though it's a bit of a similar situation brewing there.
So yeah, Man United, same old story. New season, nothing changes.
So staying with the repercussions of the game at Old Trafford, Mo Salah used it as an opportunity to talk about his contract situation. The killer quote in his post-match interview was that everyone knew that this was going to be his last year at the club.
Trent Alexander-Arnold and Virgil van Dijk are also out of contract at the end of the season, so Liverpool don't just have Salah to think about. Rob, let me pose this question to you. Are Liverpool interested in Mo Salah staying beyond the end of this season? And is Mo Salah himself interested in staying? Or is this just a big game of chicken to start everyone talking about it?
Well, the game of chicken is interesting because just a bit of background on the interviews. Mo Salah doesn't do interviews. Everyone knows that. Journalists don't get to speak to him. Broadcasters rarely get to speak to him. He's done 2 broadcast interviews in the first 3 weeks of the season. He also did an interview after the Ipswich game. The company that were doing it were told no questions about his contract. You can ask about the game, but no questions about his future. 2 weeks later, he scores at Old Trafford. He's not asked about his contract situation, presumably because he's been told, again, don't ask about his contract situation. And he comes out with that line, it's my last year at the club. That, to me, feels very staged, very deliberate, almost like, ball's in your court, go for it.
It's interesting you say that about Mo Salah, because I spoke to someone at Liverpool maybe 2 or 3 years ago. He'd just done an interview with Vanity Fair, which is an unusual outlet for a footballer to speak to. And I said, look, that's Mo. He likes to project an air of mystique. He's very conscious of his brand, I guess, and he knows exactly when he says something, when it'll go, when it'll be picked up, and the timing of things is almost as good as his goal scoring. He arrives at perfect time with the perfect quote. So the situation with Salah is, as we know, that he's out of contract in the summer, and Liverpool have had a lot of change at the club. We know that Jurgen Klopp left at the end of last season, but also Michael Edwards came back to the club, the transfer guru, as he was called, the director of football for FSG, Liverpool's owners. And also Richard Hughes came into the club from Bournemouth as technical director, sporting director. So complete change of transfer recruitment regime. They brought in Arne Slot on a similar level that Edwards and Hughes surprised a lot of people. Nobody really saw Arne Slot coming. It was going to be Xabi Alonso, it was going to be Ruben Amorim, but it was Arne Slot. So they work a bit differently at Liverpool. And the situation with Salah, it's tied in with Van Dijk and it's tied in with Trent, but they're all separate kind of elements. So obviously Trent Alexander-Arnold, we know, mid-20s, peak of his career, out of contracts in the summer.
Local boy. Massive pressure on him to almost like come clean, really, because I know it's a long time ago, but Steve McManaman and Michael Owen both kind of fell foul of the Liverpool fans a little bit by how they managed their final year of their contract. Steve McManaman managed down and went to Real Madrid on a free. Michael Owen was sold to Madrid at the start of his final year because they didn't want to lose him for nothing. So Trent Alexander-Arnold is a similar situation to those, where local kid, the scouts in the team as they sing. Now, can Trent Alexander-Arnold go through a season by not telling the fans what he's doing if he's going to leave? That'd be really, really hard, and I think the fans would make it difficult for him. Virgil van Dijk, slightly different. He's had a bad injury 2-3 years ago, but since the crucial injury, he's barely missed a game, Van Dijk. But he's a big earner. And Mo Salah, again, massive earner, superstar player. They turned down £150 million from Al Ittihad a year ago. It was September last year in the window. So on the basis that Liverpool knew it was a massive amount of money to turn down, but they felt that Mo Salah, for the remaining 2 years of his contract, would contribute. Now, the situation now is that, again, like Alexander-Arnold, he's entering the final year of his contract. He knows his value. I think he's only 32, so he knows that he could get another two-year deal at Liverpool. Mo Salah looks after himself very well. I think they get plenty of value at Mo Salah, but it would cost a lot of money. Whether Liverpool want to pay that money, the situation with Van Dijk is the same. You've got your 2 biggest earners who are out of contracts, and they're both on the wrong side of 30. So no talks have taken place. And the situation right now is that there's a kind of a bit of a standoff whereby Liverpool would like him to stay, but they don't want to pay too much money for him to stay. But they would, they'd accept him leaving. As unpalatable as it is, they'd accept Mo Salah leaving because, from a business perspective, he's in the wrong side of 30. Arne Slot hasn't come clean on what he wants to do yet, but I'm pretty sure Arne Slot would like Mo Salah to stay in the team. Mo Salah would probably like to stay at Liverpool because it's Liverpool, one of the biggest clubs in the world, Champions League football, big money, but he knows that he could get that wherever he plays. If he runs his contract down, there'll be all sorts of offers for Mo Salah, even at 33 as he is next summer. Saudi Arabia will be there again. He's from Egypt, that is his part of the world, is the Middle East, and the challenge you've got to Saudi Arabia for some players is not there for Mo Salah. He's an absolute icon there. But I remember I was in Saudi Arabia during the World Cup, and I went over to Saudi to do something on Newcastle, and I was speaking to people in Saudi Arabia, and at the time, obviously, the World Cup was on, it was Ronaldo, it was Messi, and I was told the 2 biggest players in Saudi Arabia by a million miles were Mo Salah and Paul Pogba, because they're both practicing Muslims. And I think that people kind of have to factor that in with Mo Salah, that he's a huge figure in that part of the world. So Salah, yes, he's playing a bit of chicken, because I don't think he's made his mind up yet, and I get the impression Liverpool haven't either. I think they're both waiting for each other to commit to something so they can then start a plan.
This season will obviously play have a big bearing on it. I mean, I was looking at his numbers since he last signed his deal 2 years ago. 98 appearances, 58 goals, 33 assists. I mean, there's absolutely no sign of him slowing down in his 30s, and as you say, he is 32. He's in absolute top physical condition. He looks after himself fantastically well, so he's not somebody you sort of think, he's in decline, or there's any sign whatsoever that he's not going to be able to deliver for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years at the highest level.
I think that the problem with Salah and Van Dijk, as you rightly said, they're both the wrong side of 30, aren't they? Those 3 lads who are on that screen behind us, if Liverpool could do one of those deals, I think beyond any shadow of a doubt it would be Trent, wouldn't it? Because that is a player to build a team around. Now, Salah at some stage is going to have to leave Liverpool. Obviously, players always have to leave clubs eventually. It's going to be hard to do. I wonder whether Liverpool are looking at this situation and thinking, Klopp's gone, we've got a new manager who's going to take time to put his imprint on the team, there's going to be a little bit of churn in the squad. Is this the right time for transition? This is going to be a difficult decision anyway with Mo Salah when he has to leave, and then we're going to have to manage it in the right way, whether they're looking at it and thinking it might not be the worst thing in the world.
Well, they did that with Sadio Mane and Roberto Firmino. That Mane, Firmino and Salah were the big 3, weren't they? And then gradually Mane went to Bayern Munich and was a disaster at Bayern, and that was perfect business by Liverpool. They got rid of him just at the right time. Firmino has gone to Saudi, hasn't done great. Firmino was a great player for Liverpool. Didn't score a lot of goals, but he's key to that system. And they started gradually over the years replacing them with Cody Gakpo, with Darwin Núñez. There's no replacement for Mo Salah. Federico Chiesa is not a replacement for Salah. He's just is an insurance policy if Salah gets injured. But they've got a year to plan ahead, and it's a big time, and it's just really difficult for a club of that stature to have three such big players.
It's a bizarre situation.
Yeah.
Well, one other element I'd throw in here is that my understanding is that Trent Alexander-Arnold, he had a very good agent. He left him. I think the family are now looking after him, and this would be, a massive contract that was going to require a lot of expertise. And I think the family have been quite demanding in terms of what they want for him. They're looking after their boy. I can understand that. It's not a criticism. But I think if the club were dealing with perhaps his old agent or an agent of long standing, then perhaps they would feel a bit more confident they could accelerate things at the normal pace and not perhaps get themselves into a position where in January, my understanding is that the Real Madrid link is genuine.
Absolutely.
In that they have had a conversation about him. Obviously in January you can start talking to them directly.
It's a very good point, and I think you're right about the experience, because the McManaman and Michael Owen things are going on. It's 20 years ago now. It's a long time ago, and it's it's a lot of our viewers and listeners won't know the story. But basically, when you're a player at a club, if you're a homegrown player, the pressure on you to do the right thing is quite high. Now, people say, well, football's a two-way street. The club has got to do the right thing by him, but Liverpool have schooled Trent Alexander-Arnold through his youth team days. They've given him his chance, and he's been a great player for them. Won everything he could win with them. So really, it's like, what does he owe Liverpool? Well, you speak to the Liverpool fans who have watched him come through. It would be very difficult for Trent Alexander-Arnold to go through this season without saying, I'm staying or I'm going. If he's going to go, he really has to manage it himself. He really has to manage that message now. And I think Liverpool as a club, again, they know that that's a difficult issue for Trent, but also they know there's not a massive market for him. Real Madrid obviously are there because Dani Carvajal's coming to the end, I guess, and Ferland Mendes is a decent defender, but Trent is a very unique player. He's one of these players that some managers like, some don't. Klopp loved him. Gareth Southgate had to be convinced. He wasn't never convinced as a right back. So Arne Slot seems to be a Trent fan, but if he's not, would losing Trent Alexander-Arnold be that big a deal for Arne Slot? Conor Bradley has shown himself to be a very good prospect. I don't think losing Trent Alexander-Arnold as a player would be a massive blow for Liverpool, but I think the optics of it, losing as a homegrown player, especially if he goes for nothing, that is the big problem. And I think that is the real challenge they're in now, Liverpool.
Just from Alexander-Arnold's point of view, you mentioned the Real Madrid link. I often think when these teams come calling, it's like a sliding doors moment, isn't it? That sometimes you get one chance to go and play for a club like Real Madrid. They've obviously in favour of signing these big free transfers. We've seen with Mbappe how hard they worked and the way that they got him eventually. Trent is only going to be a free agent in his mid-20s once, and there's an ongoing situation, I suppose, with Erling Haaland. In the Erling Haaland and the people around him have made no secret that he would one day like to play in Spain. Real Madrid, obviously the biggest club in Spain, but those opportunities don't come around very often. And now there's a situation where he may never get to play for Real Madrid because they've signed Mbappe, and he has to find a different route through his career. That it'd be very, very hard for Trent Alexander-Arnold, particularly if Liverpool aren't making the right noises about his deal and what he will become at Liverpool. If Real Madrid come calling and saying this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, for him to turn that down, because they just don't come around.
Yeah, I think the big thing is just the communication with the fans. I think the fans probably deserve that because he's a homegrown player. It's like, I don't think anyone could begrudge Trent Alexander-Arnold and move to Real Madrid. He's won everything at Liverpool. He has done everything. He's played for his boyhood club. He's won everything. He may stay and become the captain, but Real Madrid, biggest club in the world. Sorry, but they're bigger than Man United, they're bigger than Liverpool, they're bigger than Barca. They are the biggest club in the world. They're absolutely massive. I just think if Trent is going to go, communicate. If he's going to stay, just communicate. There's too much kind of behind closed doors about this. I think sometimes players just say, look, this is the situation, and this is what we're trying to do. And
a lot of the dynamic of it will depend on how Liverpool do this season, of course. I mean, if they've obviously started very well, if they were to have a serious tilt at winning the league, and two of those three sign, you'd say, well, okay, we'll take that. But if they fall away and then they don't qualify for the Champions League and they're losing, say, two of the three, then it becomes a completely different dynamic, doesn't it? And you sort of look at a club that is not losing a player from a position of strength. They're suddenly thinking, oh, actually, there's a couple who are jumping ship here, and where's that going to leave us?
And they've also got a question mark over Alisson Becker. Is he going to stay next summer? Is he going to leave? And can you imagine in one summer, Alexander-Arnold, Salah, Van Dijk and Becker all leave Liverpool for the biggest parts of their success? I'm not saying it'll happen, but that is a prospect that is on the line, and it could even happen in January, whereby a lot of uncertainty swirling around. They've left it too late on Trent. They have. The other two, I think they're managing it quite well.
And that's the point that I don't really understand about Liverpool, because from the outside, particularly, Liverpool are seen as quite a well-run club, aren't they? And squads churn and players leave, and it happens to everyone. But to let 3 players of such standing in your squad all get to within a year of your contract expiring in the same year, I think is mismanagement. I don't see how that has benefited everyone. We wouldn't be having the same discussion if they'd already tied Trent to a long-term deal and we were just talking about Van Dijk and Salah.
Well, I mean, you're right. Although if we drill down into the 3 examples, we'd say, well, Salah, is clever enough to run his deal down to this position himself because he knows his value. Van Dijk's had a very, very serious injury. You wouldn't be in his 30s. You wouldn't be renegotiating his deal during that period until you know where he's hit. And I've already explained the situation with Alexander-Arnold around him. So you can understand why although it all adds up to look like mismanagement. I think, in fairness to Liverpool, I think they've got 3 very specific cases that they couldn't have done a lot about. Yeah, it is a bit like a perfect storm.
I think with Van Dijk and Salah, they've managed it quite well. They're kind of keeping an eye on their decline, but there's no decline in Salah and there's no decline in Van Dijk, so they probably now need to make a decision. With Trent, they've left it too late. They should have dealt with it a year ago. Simple as that, because just over 100 days now till January the window opens. Then it's a free for all, because he could then speak to Real Madrid and agree a deal, and they're not going to get anything back for him. So they're either going to get nothing for him or they give him a massive new contract. So they've kind of messed up on that one. So if you're watching this on YouTube, we'd love to know what you think. Put some questions or comments in the comment section and we'll get back to you on the next episode of the Football Reporter.